Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the SEC's final private fund advisor rules. My name is Pat Palinko, and I'm a partner and co-head of the investment management practice at Seward & Kissel. Today, I'm joined by four of my fellow IM partners, Dan Bressler, Debbie Francis, Joe Morrissey, and Kevin Neubauer. As a preliminary matter, we note that the final rules were scaled back from the proposals, but we're only going to be focusing today on what made it to the final rules. So we're going to turn to the restricted activities rule first. Dan, can you start us off with a high-level summary of this rule?
Absolutely. So under this rule, all private fund advisors must provide disclosure and in some cases receive consent for certain activities. This cannot be blanket disclosure or consent. It needs to be done with respect to each occurrence with sufficient detail about the relevant activities. And there's 5 items here. The first 3 are disclosure. Disclosure is required to charge a fund for regulatory or compliance expenses of the advisor, to reduce a clawback for taxes, or to allocate expenses related to a portfolio investment on a non-pro-rata basis. For the first 2 of these, disclosure is required quarterly within 45 days, which for registered advisors lines up with the quarterly report timing that we'll talk about later on, at least for the first 3 quarters of the year. For the third one, allocating expenses related to a portfolio investment on a non-pro-rata basis, that disclosure needs to be made in advance. The other 2 pieces here are the consent requirements. So consent is needed to charge a fund for expenses associated with an investigation of the advisor by a governmental or regulatory authority. And consent is also needed to borrow money, securities, or other assets from a private fund. There's also one remaining prohibition in here. Under the proposals, these were prohibitions, and like Pat mentioned, they got scaled back significantly. One remains here, which is that you cannot charge a fund for expenses related to an investigation that results in a sanction for violating the Advisors Act or its rules.
Thanks, Dan. I have a couple follow-ups. So first, does the rule provide a specified method for obtaining consent?
Well, yes and no. Some pieces are clear. The consent needs to be written, and it needs to be on a case-by-case basis. It can't be done, in advance, built into your offering documents or anything of that sort. A majority of unaffiliated investors is needed for consent, and you also need to ask all investors. So even if you have a couple large investors that make up 51%, you still need to go out to the remaining 49% and give them the disclosure and ask for their consent, whether or not it's going to matter. You also can't use an LPAC or independent directors or other non-fiduciaries under the Advisors Act. This consent needs to be actually from investors, and it needs to be informed. So, for example, on a consent for a loan, you need to give the material terms of that loan in order for investors to be able to give informed consent. So there are a lot of pieces that are clear. There are still some that are less clear. So, for example, whether consent or disclosure, for that matter, can be done on a class level if the relevant activity only impacts one class of investors. It's also not clear what happens when an investor base changes between the time of consent and the relevant activity. And with an open-end fund, there can be constant subscriptions or redemptions. So investor base will change, or at least the ratio of investors to each other will change. And a big point that a lot of the rules will impact is sub-advisors, and it's unclear how a sub-advisor can provide disclosure or receive consent from investors when they don't have a relationship with those investors. There's no way for them to directly communicate with them.
So it seems like there are a number of interpretive issues, Dan. You've explained that an advisor can't charge a fund for expenses associated with an investigation of the advisor or its related persons. Is it necessarily clear when an investigation begins, such that the expenses can't be charged to the fund?
No, not always. It's certainly not always clear when an investigation starts. The SEC has said it's determined based on the information available. So there will be some judgment calls here. And when it does start, it's not always clear what fees and expenses are associated with the investigation. The target of an investigation is not always known. And there's going to have to be another judgment call for an advisor to determine whether the investigation is of the advisor or its related persons, or the fund, or another client, or a third party altogether. This also becomes even more important if the investigation results in a sanction that requires reimbursement, which raises other questions. Similar to my point before, who receives this reimbursement? The current investors may not be the ones that initially paid the amount. Excuse me. So that there's all these questions that'll still come up.
So the disclosure will have to include the amount of any advisor regulatory or compliance fees or expenses that are paid by the fund. What types of expenses would be picked up here?
Well, certainly ADV, Form PF, other Advisors Act items. It's less clear as to other expenses that are clearly regulatory, but maybe not for the advisor. So you could think of 13G, for example. The fund may not be a reporting person; it may just be the advisor. Although it relates to fund activities and it's not an Advisors Act filing. You could think the same thing for legal expenses related to various trading items, whether it's MMPI or Reg M or something else. Those regulations apply to the advisor and the fund. There's also expenses that may or may not be regulatory. This brings to mind mixed use treatment for soft dollars. So you could think of an order management system that performs some compliance checks, and is that regulatory or not is an open question.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly among our client base, we have a number of clients where the private funds might have a specified expense like PF as a fund expense. Does this disclosure requirement apply even though it's already identified as a fund expense?
It does, yes. And excuse me, the disclosure here needs to be a lot more specific. And give the actual dollar amounts that were expensed. So step one is having the ability to charge these expenses to the fund, and that should be built into the fund documents. Step two is on a quarterly basis disclosing what expenses were actually charged based on that authority that you have.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about the non-pro rata allocation of expenses. Can you provide some examples of expenses related to a portfolio investment that might typically be allocated on a non-pro rata basis?
Well, the biggest one, and the one the SEC highlights the most, is broken deal. So a broken deal that you're pursuing an investment, and you will bring in co-investors, and the deal falls apart, and there's other expenses. This is the big example, and it raises the question of when a co-investor becomes a client. And unlike other disclosure items, this one needs to be made prior to allocating the expense, which puts a lot of time pressure on making this determination. What is really helpful here, though, is that the SEC gives flexibility on pro rata. They intentionally did not define pro rata, so it can mean different things in different contexts.
So what should private fund advisors do now to prepare for the compliance date of the restricted activities rule?
Yeah, I think that the big thing that on this piece that advisors should be doing is doing a full analysis of their expenses, determining how to categorize them. Excuse me, so they know what fits into what category, how to disclose them, and whether consent is needed in what circumstances. Having this sort of understanding is the first step. Then you can apply the rule to it.
Right. Okay, thanks, Dan.